Okay, so we're recording now. I'm gonna click go live and we're going live. Add a title. Sorry guys, mass releases. Okay, there we go. And it's loading. All right, we're live. So thanks to those who can join us today. We're hosting a panel on mass releases during COVID, trying to talk about what we can do, how we can push the boundaries during COVID to take some revolutionary action so that the world we end up with after this COVID pandemic looks a little more fair. So I have with me, so first of all, I should start by saying it's Strength and Sisterhood that is organizing this event. We have with us one member from Strength and Sisterhood, an incredible advocate and activist, Renee. If you want to wave, Renee.
Hello.
That's great. And we also have with us Dave Milgaard, who I'll read you a bit about Dave and then I'll let him introduce himself. So David Milgaard was born in July 7th, 1952 in Winnipeg, Manitoba in Canada. He was arrested for non-capital murder at 16 years of age. He was convicted from this crime that took place in the Prairie City of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Dave was not guilty in any way of this crime, and he became involved with social justice issues while inside prison and brought grassroots people into a prison to speak to prisoners. He's fought, I think he fought prison administrators to do that event, and I think he's fought them ever since. His mother, Joyce Milgaard, never gave up in her fight to prove the truth about her son's innocence, and she secured his freedom after he served more than 22 years imprisonment. And then we, of course, have with us the fabulous Senator Kim Pate, who, well, I think she doesn't really need much of an introduction. She's done a lot of incredible work with prisoners for the past 35 years, and I think we've all seen the work she's doing on this issue currently. So a little tidbit, though, I wanted to say is that Strength and Sisterhood was actually founded in 1995 by Gail Horry, who's a lifer out in BC. And she's been an incredible activist. And Gail would always say that Kim was foundational to some of the work that Strength and Sisterhood was able to do, that she provided a sort of a national, brought them to the national policy discussions, and that made a big difference to the work that CIS could do. Recently, we've revitalized Strength and Sisterhood and with a group of women with lived experience and their allies. And I would just like to say that Kim has also been a mentor to many of our members that are a part of the group today. So thank you, Kim, for your work, and thank you all for your work and for being here with us today. David, I think you had a tribute that you wanted to share.
Well, what I did at one point, I wrote a chapbook. A lot of the writing I did, I started while I was inside prison, and some of it's published, and I made a dedication in that small little book, and I think it's appropriate to read it because we're really reaching out to everyone that's watching this in a way to touch the humanity of the people so that they realize that there's a need to reach in and to help others, particularly those right now that are caught up in a situation that they are inside prison. It says, "This is dedicated to people that are really decent men and women, those that have kept tender mercies free for all and have a feeling for simply life. I say this as opposed to those of blighted statures, of governments, of any one person that keeps life down, just as guards keep prisoners.
Great, thank you for that. Normally what we would do at the beginning of any event is sort of to honor the fact that we are on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. And so I know a number of you are joining from various places across Canada, so it's difficult to pay tribute and honor the land that we're unwelcome guests on. But what I wanted to do instead is start us off by honoring all of our Indigenous brothers and sisters who are currently dealing with this pandemic inside of prison walls. Because obviously our minds are with them and our hearts are with them, and we're fighting for them currently now. So to start us off, I thought what we could talk about, so SIS has done some work trying to raise awareness, and that it was at the top of our mind, the urgency of getting women especially, but also men out of prison during this time to stop the spread of COVID and just keep people safe. One of the things that occurred to us is that Corrections Service Canada has a number of legal obligations that it owes to prisoners inside, and what we're hearing from, particularly from women inside, about the conditions of their confinement points to the fact that CSC really isn't honoring those obligations. And in this time, in fact, it seems impossible for CSC to meet all of its legislative requirements to provide for the humane and safe custody, or to contribute to reintegration success, and on and on and on, while we're hearing about conditions of lockdowns and segregation. So I was hoping that any one of you could provide, paint a bit of a picture for the people watching about what it's like, what are the conditions like in prisons right now due to COVID, and how does that affect, what would be the impact of those conditions on the people inside right now?
I think it would be great for you to start, Renee, because you would know what it's like when people are talking about all the lockdowns and segging people and stuff that's been happening.
Well, I know we're just hearing snippets of what is going on inside. But having been incarcerated myself for 18 years, it was really difficult during lockdowns. So I can only imagine what's happening now with all of the restrictions that we're hearing about that women and men are being subjected to, and being in those type of conditions, based on my own experience, you already go into prison feeling helpless, dehumanized, and disenfranchised. Just everything that is synonymous with all of that, you feel that, and you feel it 100 times more. So, and there's going to be obviously tension inside. We've seen that from other countries right now with the COVID crisis, where there's been riots, there's been an increased violence, and a lot of people in society would probably say, well, what do you expect? You're locking up the worst of the worst with a bunch of people, other violent individuals. But we have to challenge that by thinking about what is going on in communities right now, with everybody being restricted to their houses, and there's been an increase in domestic violence in society. So imagine what that's like when you're locked inside a cell, and then if you're in medium security or minimum security, where you're supposed to have way more freedom, but you're told that certain stuff is being taken away, or you have to stay in your room, then imagine what type of tension that is if you're confined, maybe 6 to 8 women in a house, and you have just the basic amenities removed because there's this panic inside prison that you're going to spread it to each other, which is a very real case, but spread it to the correctional officers. So there's a lot of restrictions that constitutionally would be subject to a habeas corpus application or even a charter challenge based on all of the restrictions and the liberties that are being removed, taken away, and there's alternatives to that exist. And that's what I'm going to leave it at for now, and then maybe push it over to David.
I think the most important thing to say for everyone that's listening, especially people that are younger people, prison is a horrible place. And now they are all living in fear of dying. Somehow, when you're caught in that kind of situation, you lose hope and you feel that you may die. And, we're talking about lockdowns. I too have done a lot of time and caught up in the situation with lockdowns. People just cannot do well as far as, mental health issues are concerned. They live in a situation where they are deprivationally held in some sort of box. That's the only way to say it. I mean, besides the cell being a box, the cage, a house, however you want to call it, people are just caught in a situation where they are deprived of what they need to be able to stay safe. Kim.
Yeah. Well, I think in addition to what both of you have said, one of the things that many people think of is if someone's in prison, then why should we care? And I think we should care because we know that our jails are not full of people who have the greatest amount of opportunity or privilege in the country or in the world for that matter. That part of the reason we should be concerned is when people end up in prison, it's often as a result of every other system that should have intervened failing. And in your case, David, it was the, biases about youth, ideas about, tunnel vision, all of the things that contributed to you being there. For many, many people, one of the realities is that, if you grow up in poverty, if you've been in the child welfare system, if you've experienced violence as a youth and or as an adult, if you are trying to cope with all of those things and in the process don't get support and assistance, you may also end up with addiction issues, you may end up with mental health issues. And when we look at who's actually in prison, it's overwhelmingly poor people, racialized people, especially Indigenous people, increasingly Black people. It's people who have experienced abuse in their past. It's people who are trying to negotiate increasingly inhospitable communities and dealing with it with addictions, getting mental health, those sorts of things. And the prisons have become the only institutions that couldn't turn people away for the past really 20, 30 years. That it's not hard to find something that you can criminalize someone for if the only model you have is a criminalization and imprisonment model. And so to provide support. And we're seeing that really starkly with the COVID crisis, because what we're seeing is for the first time, people who never thought of themselves as vulnerable, feeling vulnerable, not just because of the health issues, but because they lost their jobs, because they were, one paycheck, two paychecks away from being in poverty themselves, because they don't have benefits and if they need supports in these times. And so what we've seen is the cuts and cutting away of our healthcare system, our social safety net, our welfare system, our health and mental health systems altogether, is that many, many people are falling through the cracks. Now we've known, if you go into the prisons for any length of time over the past few decades, there are that's where people are ending up. And prisons have been used essentially because we didn't have homeless strategies. They've been used as, for battered women who have fought back against abusers when they haven't been supported by the state, especially if we look at the whole issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and the fact that the same issues that contribute to Indigenous women increasingly going missing, being disappeared and murdered is also what contributes to them to being the fastest growing prison population in this country. When you look at all of those factors, and that most every adult in this country if asked, if honest, would have to say that they have done something at some point in their lives for which they could have been criminalized, but many were not. Many were, many were not, in large part because of who they were, who they knew, opportunities they had, breaks given, or nobody ever knew what they'd done, or it was never discovered. And so when we know that full picture, we need to take a look at what does it say when we choose to, as you both have talked about, choose a certain group to almost be sacrificial in this time. We know that people are concerned about what's happening in seniors' homes, as where there have also been cuts, where people are underpaid who work there, where people don't have benefits and those sorts of things. I mean, my mom's in a seniors' home, and we're all terrified. The minute COVID gets into one of those places, it spreads like wildfire. Same thing in prisons, same thing in psychiatric hospitals. And yet we're not, as we somehow see the people who have ended up in prisons as it's all their fault, and don't have the same kind of concern and humanity for those individuals as we do for say seniors in a seniors home. And so I think we do need to rethink all of that, because all of those issues are real, that it's disproportionately those who are most marginalized who end up in prison in the first place, not necessarily those who cause the greatest harm to society. And secondly, when people do go to prison in this country, aside from, I think we're up to about 15 men who have been sentenced to essentially multiple life sentences, multiple parole and eligibility periods. Every other person who gets sentenced in this country, the expectation is that if they go through, if they follow their correctional plan, if they do all the things that are expected of them, that they will eventually rejoin society. And so when we know that, and we know that in any 1 year, anywhere up to 4,000 or 5,000 or more prisoners go into prisons in the federal system, more in the provincial and territorial jails, and come out, then we should be looking at, in this time, following what we know is supposed to be working, and what we know what we're being told to do in the community, which is provide space so that we can physically distance and practice the hygiene we need to. One of the things that was I was going to say shocking, but maybe not shocking, but surprised me most is when we put out a statement on March 13th about the need to depopulate or decarcerate the prisons. I thought I did hear from families, I did hear from former prisoners, I did hear from people in prison as well. In fact, today I can't remember, 5 or 6 more calls from folks in prison, and then more from family members, and more from doctors and lawyers and the like. But one of the things that really surprised me was I got calls from a number of doctors and medical professionals who work in prisons, who were extremely concerned that the advice they were giving to corrections, not just federal, but also provincial, wasn't necessarily being followed. That in some cases, it was being followed. In Ontario, they stopped putting intermittent sentences in people on intermittent sentences in jail. In Nova Scotia, some of the judges did bail courts on the weekend to try and get more, and bail reviews to get more people out. And so there were various things across the country. But what the doctors all agreed on is that the first advice they were all giving was, first you have to get people out, especially those who are already vulnerable because of their health, those who are close to being released or who could be released, have a home to go to, and start to reduce the numbers. And then look at things like using hotels or dormitories or places that weren't, that were being closed down because people weren't traveling, they weren't using them, and use those to provide the physical spaces for individuals to be safe. And then if, whoever's left in the prison, who, for whatever reason, they're sentenced, there's can't find places to go, people are fearful, whatever the issue is, that those individuals then can be provided with safe space, not just locked in segregation, in order to have them be able to, they be safe, and also the staff who are coming in and out. And I think the other thing is the prisons, the virus could not be generated in the prisons. It had to be introduced because it came from outside. And so when corrections is being asked, what have they done? And they say, well, they've stopped all visits. They've stopped all the things that provide positive interactive support for people. and the only individuals allowed to come in are staff. And we've heard lots of stories from staff themselves. I've had staff calling me saying, I tested positive, I reported it, it's not showing up, but corrections isn't keeping track of these numbers, and it's not showing up in this prison where I work that actually someone has tested positive. And I had interaction with other staff and a whole bunch of prisoners, and that should have been, they should be being tested, because the concern is, for the obvious concern, that they were spreading it. And so I think there are some very real concerns about how human rights and charter rights and the provisions of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act have not been followed. And in the midst of all this, we see the government drop its appeal of the segregation cases that were before the Supreme Court of Canada. Now, some people were saying, oh, this is a great thing. I see it as quite the opposite. Right now, we had last year, the Senate made recommendations, amendments to the legislation that replaced segregation with structured intervention units. And then there's all this other, proliferation of other kinds of segregation units that don't even come under that legislation, and so escape scrutiny. And what Corrections has done is they've because that case has been withdrawn, and at the same time as they're using massive use of segregation, because lockdowns are essentially putting everybody in segregation, they now won't even come under that scrutiny to show how severe and how significant the abuse of their power, their processes have been during this pandemic. And so I think there's huge concerns, and I do agree with Renée and with David that we should be looking at it. These are extraordinary times, and it calls for extraordinary remedies. Things like group habeas corpus, things like group human rights complaints, things like pushing on the ministers and the privy councillors who have the authority to make recommendations for the use of the royal prerogative of mercy. Certainly in my discussions with members of the parole board, they were extremely concerned. Before this pandemic started, there were at least 94 people that they knew of that they had granted parole to who were still not released from prison. I've been asking questions almost every day. How many of those people are still in? How many got out? And how many more have been granted parole since then? And one of the things we're encouraging is every single person who's eligible for parole or who has compromised immune systems and has mental health issues, that there be applications put in for immediate, exceptional parole, if you will, basically parole because of their circumstances. And my understanding is if people are putting in those applications, the parole board, even if Corrections doesn't agree that they deserve a compassionate or an exceptional release, that they are at least being slated then for parole hearing. So there are a number of things that are being done. There are a number of things that could be being done. But one of the biggest problems is Corrections has not taken the initiative at this time to do what many other countries and even some of the other provinces have done, which is to look at who can be released safely. How can we reduce the numbers? How can we basically assist people from not just being sitting ducks in prison?
Amazing, thank you. I think you've answered pretty much every question I have here, but I think it would be fantastic now to kind of pull apart some of what all of you have touched on. So I want to bring us back to something that, something that Renée had said about, and Kim, you picked up on this as well, that there's, right now we're seeing constitutional violations happening, charter violations happening in the prisons with the way the prisons have chose to deal with COVID, which is to lock prisoners down into segregation, basically, or solitary confinement, rather than follow through on a number of releases. I mean, we also took a call from a woman who was on her stat release, and they only processed her file on the Friday when her stat was on the Monday. I mean, that was something that could have been done months in advance, given the state that we're in. So based on that, I wanted to pick up on this idea that you said, Kim, about, well, you did the crime, you did the time, which is something that we hear a lot. And right now what we're seeing is the state breaking the law, essentially, right? violating the charter and prisoners' human rights. And there, we're not seeing the same kinds of consequences befall these state institutions who are constantly failing people, which is actually contributing to the problem of the over-incarceration that we're seeing, or the over-reliance on the prison system that we're seeing. So I wanted to bring that to this idea back, to bring it back to COVID, and the idea that it's not, we've heard it said that COVID is a great equalizer, but it's not a great equalizer. Really, it's a great highlighter of inequality that exists in the communities. And so something that you had said, Kim, about we need to have these releases, like we need group habeases, which I'd like to touch on a bit more later, and we need extraordinary remedies because it's extraordinary times. What we're hearing sometimes is that there are gaps in community. There aren't places for people to go that they can self-isolate. They're only communal settings, or people are under capacity right now and they don't have the ability to support these kinds of releases. So I'm curious what you would say to that, and if Dave and Renee, if you have any ideas, and what can community members, what can organizations be doing right now to fill those gaps?
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the things I wanted to bring up was there's an underutilization of Section 81 of the CCRA, and that's basically, it's similar to Section 84, which is specific to Indigenous offenders, but it's really underutilized even before this pandemic. But what it essentially means is that corrections contracts with various First Nations communities, whether it's on the reserve or urban, at Healing Lodge, and what have you, to actually have people who are eligible and sometimes not even eligible at their point in their sentence, to be released into the community. So they wouldn't have to wait for a parole board hearing, as long as the community was willing to take them, and they worked with them, developed a plan, like a community plan, relapse prevention plan, and so forth. They could take them. But the problem is, not a lot of First Nations communities are willing to step up and contract with CSC and take their own people back into the community. So this is where I step in as an Indigenous woman and challenge First Nations communities. We have over 633 to, instead of, it's brilliant that people, First Nations people and leaders talk about over-incarceration, talk about Indigenous women, talk about missing and murdered women, but it really comes down to challenging First Nations communities and leaders to step up, back up what you're saying, and contract with corrections to get your people back into the community and out of prison. So that's one idea. But I also really want to push the habeas corpus application, because yes, people will say the parole board has the exceptional authority to grant medical releases, different kinds of releases that are in their authority. But realistically, how many hearings is the parole board going to have in a month? They're not going to have that much. And with the rate of infection and people who have compromised immune systems in the system, which is very high, whether it's due to Hep C or some other contagious disease, this infection will spread very quickly, and it will become a big issue in 2 or 3 months, where we were saying, or a bunch of other people were saying, let's get people out right now to stop this spread. So with the habeas corpus, I think that even if there's a lot of lawyers who are hesitant to do it, either because of reputation or hesitancy, or it's never been tried before, I want to again challenge lawyers and say, at some point, you were young, you were starting out, you probably took on cases that you did not think had a chance, or other people were telling you did not have a chance, back away, but you went ahead and did it because you believed in it. So I think we need to again challenge different lawyers, different legal authorities to say, hey, this is not unrealistic. This is, beyond extenuating circumstances. It's not something that we've seen before. So why are we not seeing more lawyers agree to do habeas corpus applications, because there's a lot of conditions of confinement that need to be challenged, and there's lives at stake.
I think if I can, there's another way to kind of foundation what's going on, and we really haven't looked at it. To begin with, the criminal justice system, it really is a failure. I see where we're looking at on the back of a prisoner's chance to change, on the continued victimization of victims, and on the community's fears and despairs. We continue to allow this growth industry to prosper. It doesn't work. We're looking right now to kind of justify getting people out of prison. Well, we don't have to justify it, because the actual prison itself and the structure and the justice model in this country is not working to help people. As a prisoner yourself, that we see people come in and go out, especially young people, and they aren't getting any better. It's because they're not trying to work with them in a way. There are many different justice models in the world that they could use that are going to probably make a lot of a difference to try to help people. I think in a lot of ways we're trying to justify get those people out of there. I think it's more of a crime to put some young man for stealing tires out of a garage inside the prison in the first place. And I think that's a point to make while we have the opportunity to hold that up in front of people. The criminal justice system in this country is a failure.
Okay. Well, thank you both for that. There's not much really to add, except that I think, thank you, Renee, for pointing out sections 20 or 81 and 84. There's also section 29, and what a lot of people didn't pay attention to when the segregation or the Bill C-83, which got rid of segregation or renamed it to structured intervention units, came in. It also limited the application of some of those provisions that allowed for people to be moved out of prisons, and really reinforced the restrictions that corrections had placed on those provisions. I'm old, so back in 1992, when I was first starting in Ottawa working, that was the first piece of legislation, the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, that I worked on, and appeared before parliamentary committees. That legislation was designed to be human rights legislation aimed at, wait for it, reducing the numbers of people in prison. And in particular, there was a focus on women, and there was a focus on Indigenous prisoners, and there was less of a focus yet on mental health issues, but there was certainly a focus on how could we reduce the numbers of Indigenous people in prison. So when that legislation was going through, Indigenous people were about 11, 12%. Women, it was about 16, 17%. Now, Indigenous prisoners are about 30%. Indigenous women are 42%. And if you go to places like Saskatchewan, Indigenous amongst girls and young women in custody, it's 98%. And if you go up north, it's 100%. So we're talking about massive, as you've said, David, who's getting put in there is more a function of inequality than anything else. And the other thing that in terms of, we've talked about the number who are poor. One of the other things that's, for the first time in years, actually, we're talking about at a national level, many people are talking about things like anti-poverty and other measures that we need to develop and build our social safety net, our healthcare safety net, all of which would, I think, based on all the research that's been done internationally, result in reduced numbers of people in prison, lower crime rates, and more people able to cope and live in the community. And so, a number of us, my colleagues now, were involved in things like looking at guaranteed livable income and basic income, and initiatives that a whole bunch of us thought were really important before this pandemic. And now many more people are thinking we need to do something, as we've seen literally the floor drop out from under many people. I think we also should look at, in addition to all the ways you both have talked about different remedies that we could be looking at, when Louise Arbour looked at the situation at the prison for women 26 years ago and issued her report, and it was 24 years ago, April 1st, that her report came out, two big recommendations that I still think we should be pushing for, and during this pandemic could be being utilized, is one, she called for and still calls for corrections, the prisons to be brought under the jurisdiction of courts. So habeas corpus is one way to do that. Another is to say the courts have a responsibility to look at what is being done in our name collectively, not just during this pandemic, but especially during this pandemic. And then the second remedy one of the remedies she suggested is that in a situation where the treatment someone receives in prison is not what the judge, whoever sentenced the person, intended them to serve. So when a judge sentences someone to prison, they don't think that they're going into segregation. They don't think that they're going to be in a situation where they will be mistreated. They don't think they'll be in situations where they're going to be punished ad nauseum. The punishment is supposed to be the separation from society. Anything that causes the person to be treated worse than that, than the separation from society, is either not allowed or there's rules about it. And where the treatment someone receives, and I think of both of you in terms of, without revealing any of your personal circumstances, but both of you suffered that. And I can think of hundreds and thousands of other people I know who have suffered similarly, where the sentence that they were subjected to amounted to correctional interference with the lawful sanction that the judge imposed. So then we talk about wrongful convictions, we can talk about all, but just that alone, if we had that remedy, I think we could be bringing a ton of people before the courts. And that may be a remedy that should be being utilized now, that you combine a habeas corpus with a saying, this was not the sentence that when this person was sentenced. Nobody knew about the pandemic, but certainly nobody anticipated that every single person in this jail would be locked down for 21, 22, 23, 24 hours, as the case may be. And it's been all of those during this pandemic. Now, it has been before this as well, but I think now is the time we should be looking at really rethinking how can we let this happen? Because as you said, Sav, that it has really shown in sharp relief how unequal our society is in so many ways. And it's why, many of us are hoping that we will see a very different society emerge out of this.
Absolutely. Thank you. You all have raised such important points that I want to come back to. We also have a question from the audience, which I think can loop into this. Something you said, Kim, just now, Arundhati Roy said that COVID is a portal. And something that you were saying, David, about the criminal justice system being a failure. I think a common theme through what all of you have said is that these systems have failed people, and many of them have landed in prisons as a result of those failures. But what we've seen too right now in terms of, so the mass releases really can be one mechanism to that new world that we want to step into when we're on the other side of COVID-19. But what we've seen is, and I'll turn to the question right now from the audience, which is from Farnaz Farhang. Sorry if I've mispronounced that. The question is, so calls by advocates, lawyers, healthcare providers asking the federal government to act and depopulate prisons have been ignored for weeks. Considering this is a time-sensitive issue and COVID-19 rates continue to increase in prisons, are there other ways that we can put more pressure on the government to act? Thank you for that question. I'll leave it to any one of you who wants to jump in.
I want to jump in really quick because I think it needs to be said. Friend of mine, no longer alive, special woman, bless her, Claire Clahane. I asked her one time, what can I use to say something about justice being delayed? And she said, well, justice delayed is justice denied, which were good, strong words. We're talking about justice for people that are sitting inside, men, women, and in some cases, children, that are right now sentenced to death. And how do you think they feel living in fear? We need to get them out of prison now. Justice delayed is justice denied. People are sitting back in a position where they can make up their own minds to take provisions that can reduce the population of prisoners, in mass, like other countries have done. If they don't do it, not only do they have to live with themselves later on, but as far as I'm concerned, that's corruption.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I know from the number of letters I'm getting and messages that lots and lots of people are letting elected officials, senators, others know what's happening and what needs to happen, and that there should be releases. I mean, I would say every effort that anybody can make to try and communicate with those who have the power and the authority to make the decisions is vitally important at this time. And the courts is one, letting those who are making decisions in Ottawa know, as well as, sharing information. I think there's been lots of information shared, whether it's through social media, the media itself, and people really need to be concerned about this. And, the time is moving along on this pandemic, but we're being told by health professionals that this is the first wave, that there's going to be at least another wave, likely during the next flu season, that there'll be possibly another wave after that before they even get a vaccine for this virus, and that this is just the first of what will likely be many others coming forward. And so, I'm not a doctor or a scientist, but I don't have any reason not to trust that. And it's also part of the reason that I've asked all of the public health officials to actually do full assessments of what's happening in the prisons. And so anybody who's listening, call up Dr. Tam, call up Bonnie Henry, call up the heads of healthcare in your respective provinces or territories, your communities, and find out what they've done in terms of an assessment of the healthcare that's being provided in, not just in seniors' homes and in the community, but in those prisons as well, because they're under their jurisdiction too. So I think there are a variety of ways that we've talked about that, because we certainly don't want to see some of the other ways that, Renee, you talked about at the beginning, that have erupted in some of the countries where people become so desperate that they try to, or they do escape, or they're hurting each other or hurting staff as they're trying to escape or get out of a very unsafe, physically unsafe situation for them. So I do think we need to keep pushing, and many of us are worried that the longer we go, the more entrenched the position becomes, and the more the various correctional services, not just federally but provincially and territorial, feel that they have, we're back to a situation that you probably remember, David, a time when, before the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, before the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that a warden was basically the king of his or her, or king, or we didn't have women wardens then, but they were basically in charge of the prison, and their rules set the tone. Heaven forbid that we allow that to happen in this country, but we're dangerously close to it. And just, even today, the announcement of finally the charges being laid against a male guard who was sexually assaulting women in one of the prisons. It's not the only situation where that's happened, but there were also managers sexually assaulting staff, and heaven knows how many other situations of sexual assault were happening there that happen in the women's prisons, men's, as well as in the youth jails. So there are so many layers at which we need to be interacting and ensuring people recognize that what we do or don't do, more to the point, when it comes to assisting and supporting those who are in prison, directly impacts all of us and implicates all of us. And people who think that that somehow doesn't help victims are missing the whole point, that virtually everybody who goes into the prisons have often first been victimized. And if you want people to come out and be more concerned for other people, then treating them in a more humane, respectful way is more likely to have that happen than treating them in degrading, dehumanizing, and with methods of power and control that are incredibly punitive.
Renee, you should talk. I like listening to the way you talk sometimes. Can you take over, Renee, just for a sec?
Oh, you're muted. Hold on.
Yes, why did you do that?
Go ahead.
Don't mute me again, host. The one thing that I do want to encourage is I would like to see more community organizations that are tasked with the mechanism of visiting women in prison or advocating for women in prison. I would like to see those organizations work together as a whole, no matter what people's mission statements are or people's own values. All of the women's organizations that I've seen are committed to helping women, whether they're marginalized, criminalized, racialized. Their mandate is to come together and use resources from other organizations in the community to help with the overreaching goal of getting women out of prison, of also preventing women from going into prison by addressing the contributing factors in the community like poverty, homelessness, abuse, marginalization, discrimination. All of this stuff, they're mandated to help women. So I think I would like to see more organizations band together and use the collective resources to come together and help women and men get out of prison in this situation, and goes beyond that, beyond this situation, to continue to work together collectively to help women and men and girls. Regardless of what, like I said, whatever the issue may be, people need to put that aside and remember what they took the job for. And if they don't believe in that type of, value or mission, then maybe it's time for them to retire or move on to a different job.
I think that as a country, right, as people, right, especially within this pandemic, I think one thing that we seem to be holding somehow is the fact that it's so nice to feel nourished and loved. And, prisoners really need nourishment and they really need love. And a lot of people out there might say, well, no, nobody's going to change. They're stuck inside a prison. Things aren't good in there for them. Well, yes, they're not good in there for them. But, it's just as important to say that all the people, and I know there are so many people that care and want to help others, and that's a good thing. And to keep that passion strong, the agencies and the people that you're talking about, that's so important, especially for some of the ones that are struggling, grassroots ones that are just trying to get off the ground themselves. People are people, and people have to remember that prisoners are people and they're not garbage. I mean, as a prisoner, as a person out now, I dream and I care about others and I want to kind of move forward. They are the very same. They care and they dream and they want to love others. They're no different than anybody here today. And I think that's important to say too, Renée.
Thank you both for those comments. We're getting some more questions from the audience, and I want to get to those quickly before we have about 10 to 15 minutes left. And something I think that can work with some of your comments too, Renée, yours about like coalition building, about coming together as groups and sharing those resources, which Kim also touched upon, to free prisoners who are human beings and have human rights, which are being denied to them right now, as you said, Dave. So the question that we're getting is to ask about examples of group releases in other jurisdictions or times in history. One of the things that comes to mind, we talked about, or Renée, you mentioned using the tool of group habeas. I think Kim, you brought that up as well. And I was wondering if Kim, maybe you could give a little bit of background on the Beaudry case, which was a group habeas, as maybe an idea or a piece of inspiration for people out there looking for creative solutions.
Sure. Well, and I hope Marjorie's watching, because she probably is. And but Marjorie, Joey, there were a bunch of women at the prison for women when it was being closed, and women had been moved to men's prisons, and and a group of women brought a habeas corpus in advance. So totally novel. So a group of women brought a habeas corpus in advance of the alleged illegal detention of transferring them to a men's prison. And, you know, it was successful. So that's been one example. If we want to look in other jurisdictions, I think of, you know, many people don't know that when Nelson Mandela became president, one of the first things he did as an act to recognize the impact that incarceration has, not just on prisoners, but on generations to come, was he freed all mothers who had children under the age of 12. Think about that. You know, right now, we could say, using the Royal Prerogative of Mercy, Section 748 of the Criminal Code of Canada, all of these people could be released right now. And if enough people wrote in to Minister Blair, to the Prime Minister, to Minister Lametti, the Minister of Justice, and said, we think you should be doing this right now, they would get a clear message. And so I think that there are opportunities like that that we could be using. There are also, you know, when we did the group human rights complaint in 2001, we did that because following up on what had happened at the prison for women, many people became really fearful once they started moving women to men's prisons of complaining because they were threatened with even worse conditions and being put into remand centers, for example. So one of the things we had to do was figure out a way to bring a review that didn't require the naming of individual women for fear that there would be repercussions. And in fact, in that process, we got staff, prisoners, managers even, disclosing that yes, if a woman used even the grievance system, she was likely to actually be treated as though she had done something wrong, even though it was the only valve of, you know, so-called remedy valve available to her. If she went to court, it was seen as a denial of responsibility and indicative of needing a higher security rating. So we have those things documented, and those are some of the things that I think courts could take note of. The correctional investigator and the Auditor General have documented all kinds of issues around the toxicity of the environment amongst staff. So if we know that there's a toxic work environment amongst staff, we know that by extension, what that environment must be like for prisoners who are trying to seek remedies. And again, I come to this today, the laying of the charges against the guard, the former correctional officer at Nova Institution. My question has been, why haven't all of those who knew and colluded about not having that situation reported also been charged with failing to, you know, basically obstruction of justice? Because not that I want to see people charged all over the place, but the reality is that officer got away with raping and sexually assaulting more women in the period that nobody did anything, when the warden, when others, you know, knew about it and no action was taken. So I think there are all kinds of ways we could be looking at taking action. The most important thing is to take action, and lots of folks are really concerned and wringing their hands. But if you're not sure what to do, send a note to at least the Prime Minister, at least the Minister of Justice, at least the Minister of Public Safety. Copy me so I know you're doing that, and we can keep track of it as well. So I think there are things we can be doing, and I'm really, really, I know we're getting close to the time, so if we got more questions, I want to leave time for that. But in case I don't get a chance, I want to thank, SIS, Strength and Sisterhood, Renee, Dave, for all the incredible work you guys are doing. The work you're trying to do with many other organizations as well is wonderful. And just a shout out to Gail Horry, who, it really was the brainchild of her and so many other women that I remember her coming and saying, you guys may not take it, when I was with EFRA, you may not take a progressive enough position. We're going to push you. And I can't think of a better role for women who've been inside to play than that. And so thank you for all the incredible work you guys are doing. And to, Renee and Sav with your, Indigenous heritage and histories, the important work that you're doing to try and make sure there's, that basically we're seeing the injustices that have disproportionately impacted Indigenous women dealt with. So just in case I don't get a chance to say anything else, and because I really should shut up now and let other people talk.
Thanks for that, Kim. Renee, did you have anything that you wanted to add on to those comments, or?
I just want to thank everybody for tuning in. I want to thank David, who is a legend, for coming on and speaking to this panel. Thank you so much, David. And for
Your sound is a little bit quiet, Renee. I don't know if.
I think you muted me, buddy.
Okay.
Your end.
Okay, it might be on my end. We've made it this far without technical issues, so it was bound to happen.
Thank you very much, Renee.
But
Thank you.
before, I think we've still got a little bit of time, and I want to squeeze a little bit more out of all of you for our viewers' sake while I have you here. So one thing I wanted to bring up, because we're talking about mass releases, we're talking about the opportunity that COVID presents to push for revolutionary action so that when we come out of this, we can do something to address these broken systems that we're all identifying that are failing our most marginalized members of society. And so one thing, I wanted to bring up this concept that I heard Ruth Wilson Gilmore raise in a talk a couple of weeks ago, and it's this idea of organized abandonment. Because what we really need is to like scoop up the most marginalized, the ones at the bottom who are, I'm seeing, get left behind in these sort of one-on-one, case-by-case, let's take out the lowest risk, or let's, we'll get those ones out, the ones who have health conditions, the ones who are low risk, we'll get those out. And I worry about the how that might legitimize the abandonment or the existence of the remaining men and women who are inside, who are left behind by that. So I wanted to put that back to you. I think, David, you've really talked about that, how we have to get them out. But I wanted to just wrestle with that concept a bit about organized abandonment and what we really need to be doing while we're moving forward and trying to take action and trying to encourage releases, push the government to make releases. How do we ensure that we're not abandoning some of the most marginalized among us?
I like to say that I've always held a position that there isn't any problem in taking the provision that's available to the Prime Minister to release all prisoners. They seem to be more open to doing, releasing some this way or some that way. Well, as far as I'm concerned, if they, empty the halfway houses that they have right now of the people that are there, they can move, some of the people are considered more of a security threat into those places. And even the people that, there are some bad people inside prison. I'm not going to say that there isn't, okay? But even those people, there's no reason, I know Kim was saying that they're able to socially distance themselves at some point. But if they really wanted to, they could simply take them out. The army could have them in a special place. That way they could say they released every single prisoner so that those people aren't sentenced to death. They have the opportunity at the proper medical care and concerns that they need, and they could actually do it. There are, like you said, dormitories and places that are being empty, where the people from universities aren't staying. And really, 80% of the people that are presently inside our prisons are no threat at all to anyone out there in society. Let's get everyone out. I like the idea of this non-abandonment. I think that's so important to say. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you. Renee, are there any last words before we end today?
Habeas corpus all the way.
Habeas corpus all the way. Anything from you, Kim?
No, I think what we've heard is great. And lest people don't know, in the mid-90s, David, all the heads of corrections, who were all men at the time, agreed with you. And in fact, they said that at that time, 75% of the people then in prison could be released without increasing risk to public safety or crime rates. So in this pandemic, we should really be looking at much more expansive opportunities. So thank you very much. And thank you to all of you. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in on Facebook.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you guys.
Thank you. I want to make a couple announcements before we end. One of them is that this has been recorded, so we'll post it later this week, or well, next week on our Facebook page. And another is I wanted to do a shout out, wish a happy birthday, a very happy birthday to Aaliyah Perini, who's a CIS member. It's her birthday today, so happy birthday, Aaliyah.
Happy birthday.
Let's sing. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Leah. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you so much, David, Kim, Renee. It's been amazing. Thanks for taking the time to be with us today. That's it. I'm so appreciative. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and please check out our Facebook page later for the full video.
Thank you, Savannah.
Take care.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Renée.
everybody.
Nice to meet you.